Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We are interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1877 in Millbrook County, Massachusetts, arrived with an unusual chill that seemed to settle into the bones of its residents. The town of Cedar Falls, a modest settlement of perhaps 300 souls, nestled between rolling hills covered in maple and oak, had always been the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business. Yet in the grand house at the end of Prospect Street, the Kincaid family had discovered something that would test the very limits of what neighbors should know about each other. The discovery came by accident, as most terrible revelations do. Jeremiah Kincaid, a successful merchant in his 43rd year, had commissioned extensive renovations to the three-story colonial house he had purchased from the estate of the late Cornelius Whitmore in the spring of that year. The house, built in 1852 by a mason named Phineas Crowley, was considered one of the finest residences in Cedar Falls, with its brick facade, tall windows, and imposing presence on the hill overlooking the town. What began as simple repairs to water damage from the previous winter's harsh storms would uncover something that challenged everything the Kincaid family believed about their new home, their community, and ultimately themselves. The events that unfolded in that house during the final months of 1877 would cast shadows that extended far beyond the walls of a single residence, touching lives across generations and raising questions about the nature of knowledge itself and the terrible weight of secrets. On the morning of October 15, 1877, Jeremiah stood in his study reviewing correspondence from his textile business when he heard his wife Abigail calling for him from the upper floors. Her voice carried a tone he had rarely heard in their 15 years of marriage. Not panic exactly, but something sharper than concern. When he reached the second-floor landing, he found her standing beneath the narrow staircase that led to the attic, holding a lantern and staring upward into the darkness. "There's something wrong with the ceiling boards," she told him, pointing to where several planks had buckled and warped, creating a gap large enough for a man's arm to pass through. Mordecai was moving furniture this morning and felt the floor give way above his head. Late, Mordecai Finch, their hired man, stood nearby with his hat in his hands, a tall, gaunt figure whose 20 years of labor had given him an instinct for the structural integrity of old buildings. Born in 1835 to a family of mill workers, Mordecai had learned construction and maintenance through necessity rather than formal training, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect problems in buildings before they became apparent to others. His reputation for reliability had made him sought after throughout Millbrook County, though he preferred to work for families who respected his quiet, methodical approach to problem-solving. He confirmed Abigail's account with a simple nod. "Feels hollow up there, Mr. Kincaid. More hollow than it should be for an attic space. The joists are sound, but there's something about the weight distribution that doesn't match what you'd expect from a standard construction." The house had been built with a traditional New England attic design, a peaked space beneath the roof used primarily for storage, accessible by the narrow staircase from the second floor. The previous owner, Cornelius Whitmore, had mentioned during the property negotiations that the attic had been sealed for structural reasons sometime in the 1860s, though he had never been specific about why. The real estate papers simply noted that the upper level was not currently in use and would require assessment before occupation. Jeremiah had accepted this limitation without much thought. His family consisted of himself, Abigail, and their housekeeper, Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, a widow in her 50s who had worked for respectable families in the area for most of her adult life. They had no need for additional storage space, and the house's lower levels provided more than adequate room for their purposes. However, the buckled floorboards suggested something more than simple disuse. When Jeremiah examined the damaged area with his lantern, he could see that the wood had not simply aged poorly, it appeared to have been deliberately weakened, as if something had been repeatedly pressing against it from above, trying to break through. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been working for the family since their arrival in Cedar Falls, noticed additional details that troubled her experienced eye. "The dust patterns aren't right," she observed quietly to Abigail later that morning. "In 30 years of keeping house, I've learned to read dust like some folks read books. Up there the dust has settled in ways that suggest air movement where there shouldn't be any, and there's a smell, faint but persistent, that doesn't belong in a sealed space." Prudence Hartwell was not given to flights of fancy. Born Prudence Whitman in 1822 in nearby Concord, she had married young and lost her husband to consumption after only 7 years of marriage. Left without resources or family support, she had entered domestic service out of necessity and discovered that she possessed an intuitive understanding of household management that made her invaluable to employers. Her reputation for discretion and competence had earned her positions with some of the most prominent families in central Massachusetts, and she had developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of how houses aged and settled over time. Her observations about the attic space carried weight because of this experience. When she mentioned the unusual air patterns and the strange smell, both Jeremiah and Abigail took notice. Mrs. Hartwell had never been wrong about structural problems or household issues in the past, and her concerns added urgency to what might otherwise have been routine maintenance. On October 16th, Jeremiah hired Caleb Ashworth, a local carpenter, to assess the damage and make the necessary repairs. Ashworth, a meticulous craftsman in his 30s who had learned his trade from his father, arrived early that morning with his tools and a reputation for thoroughness that had earned him steady work throughout Millbrook County. Caleb Ashworth came from a family of builders who had been working in Massachusetts since the 1790s. His grandfather, Joshua Ashworth, had participated in the construction of several notable buildings in Boston during the federal period, and the family had maintained detailed records of construction techniques, materials, and architectural innovations spanning 3 generations. This background had given Caleb an unusual depth of knowledge about building practices and an ability to recognize when construction deviated from standard methods of any particular period. What Ashworth discovered when he climbed into the attic space would later be described in his written report to the town selectmen as an irregularity in construction that defied standard building practices of the period. The official language concealed something far more troubling, but the full details of his findings would not emerge for several days as he conducted increasingly thorough examinations of the space. The attic, which should have been a single open space running the length of the house, had been divided into 2 distinct sections. The front portion, accessible from the main staircase, was standard in every respect: wooden beams, proper ventilation, and clear sight lines to the roof structure. However, approximately 2/3 of the way back, a wall had been constructed that sealed off the rear section completely. This wall was not part of the original architectural plan. Ashworth, who had studied the building techniques of Phineas Crowley through examination of other structures the mason had built in the area, recognized immediately that the work had been done by different hands. Where Crowley's craftsmanship was precise and economical, this wall showed signs of hasty construction and unusual materials: stones that didn't match the house's foundation, mortar that appeared to have been mixed with substances other than the standard lime and sand combination used elsewhere in the building. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be personal effects embedded within the mortar itself. Ashworth's initial report, filed with the town clerk's office on October 18, 1877, mentioned fabric remnants and other materials incorporated into the binding agent, but provided no further detail. A more complete account would emerge only through his private correspondence with his brother, discovered decades later in family papers. In a letter dated October 19, 1877, Caleb wrote to his brother Nathan in Worcester, "The work I am examining here defies explanation through standard construction practices. The wall in question has been built not to support the house's structure, but clearly to contain something within the sealed section behind it. The stones have been arranged in a pattern that suggests the builder was more concerned with preventing anything from passing between them than with creating a stable partition." The carpenter's detailed examination revealed that the wall incorporated materials that had no legitimate purpose in construction. Along with the fabric remnants, he found what appeared to be human hair worked into the mortar in several locations, and small metal objects that might have been personal jewelry or buttons. Most troubling were the bones, clearly from small animals, but worked into the foundation of the wall in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental incorporation. When Ashworth reported his findings to Jeremiah Kincaid that evening, he recommended that the wall be left undisturbed. "Some construction choices are made for reasons we don't need to understand," he told the merchant. "The building is sound, and that partition isn't causing the floor damage below. I can reinforce the damaged boards without touching what's behind that wall." But Jeremiah Kincaid was not a man easily dissuaded from pursuing answers. His success in business had come from his willingness to examine details that others overlooked, and the presence of an unexplained sealed space in his own home represented exactly the kind of mystery that demanded resolution. Moreover, the strange materials discovered in the wall's construction suggested that whatever lay beyond it might pose ongoing risks to his family's safety and well-being. Jeremiah's background had prepared him to approach problems systematically and methodically. Born in 1834 to a family of merchants in Hartford, Connecticut, he had received a solid education that included mathematics, accounting, and basic engineering principles. His business success had come from his ability to analyze complex situations and identify solutions that others missed. The sealed chamber represented a puzzle that engaged all of his analytical instincts, even as it troubled his sense of domestic security. On the evening of October 19th, after Ashworth had completed his repairs to the damaged floorboards, Jeremiah returned to the attic alone. He brought with him a heavier lantern, a set of tools, and a determination to understand what Phineas Crowley had hidden behind that wall nearly 25 years earlier. The mason's work had been thorough, but not impenetrable. Working carefully to avoid damaging the surrounding structure, Jeremiah began to remove stones from the upper portion of the wall, where the mortar appeared to have aged more poorly. The work was difficult and time-consuming. Each stone had to be chipped free without disturbing those around it, and the confined space made it difficult to position himself properly for leverage. As he worked, Jeremiah noticed details that Ashworth had not mentioned in his report. The stones themselves were not uniform in size or composition, suggesting that they had been gathered from multiple sources rather than quarried specifically for this project. Some bore markings that appeared to be deliberate, scratches or gouges that formed patterns too regular to be accidental damage. Others showed signs of exposure to extreme heat, with surfaces that had been partially melted or fused in ways that standard construction fires could not explain. After nearly 3 hours, he had created an opening large enough to pass a lantern through. The light revealed a space approximately 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roof line. The floor was wooden planking similar to that in the front section of the attic, but the walls showed the same mixed stone construction as the partition itself. The smell that emerged from the sealed space was not the musty odor of long-closed rooms, but something more complex and unsettling, a mixture of dampness, decay, and something else that Jeremiah could not immediately identify but found deeply unpleasant. The odor carried notes that reminded him of the tanneries he had visited in his business dealings, but with an underlying sweetness that suggested organic decomposition of a different nature entirely. More troubling still were the objects he could see scattered across the floor of the hidden chamber. There were books, not the leather-bound volumes one might expect to find stored in an attic, but what appeared to be notebooks or journals, their pages yellowed and warped with moisture. There were also tools, though not the construction implements, that might reasonably be expected in a space created by a mason. These were smaller, more delicate instruments that seemed designed for detailed work of a different nature entirely. Most disturbing were the wooden containers arranged along the far wall. From the opening he had created, Jeremiah could count at least 6 rectangular boxes, each approximately the size of a large jewelry case, lined up with military precision. The wood appeared to be of high quality, sealed with what looked like wax or some other preservative material that had helped them resist the deterioration that had affected other objects in the space. The discovery of the sealed chamber was reported to no official authority. According to documents found in the Kincaid family papers after their deaths, Jeremiah made the decision that evening to conceal his findings from both the local constabulary and his wife. His journal entry for October 19, 1877, found among his personal effects in 1892, provides the only contemporary account of his reasoning. Jeremiah's journal, bound in black leather and written in his precise merchant's hand, would become one of the most important documents in understanding not only what happened in the sealed chamber, but the psychological impact of the discovery on the man who made it. The entries from this period reveal a mind struggling to process information that challenged his fundamental understanding of human nature and moral responsibility. What I have found in the upper portion of this house represents knowledge that no man should possess and no family should bear, he wrote on the night of October 19th. P. Crowley, in his final work upon this property, chose to hide rather than destroy what he had done, perhaps believing that concealment was sufficient to prevent further harm. I am not convinced that he was correct in this assumption, but I understand his choice. Some discoveries carry responsibilities that extend beyond the discoverer, responsibilities that may prove too heavy for any single individual to bear. The following morning, Jeremiah informed his wife that the attic repairs had been completed successfully, and that Ashworth had recommended the space remain sealed for structural reasons. Abigail accepted this explanation without question, as she had long trusted her husband's judgment in practical matters. Mordecai Finch was told that the attic was unsafe for access and should be considered permanently off-limits. Mrs. Hartwell was instructed to discontinue her periodic inspections of the upper floors and to focus her attention on the main living areas of the house. What Jeremiah did not reveal to his family was that his examination of the sealed chamber had been far more extensive than his initial report suggested. Between October 20th and October 25th, 1877, he made 4 additional visits to the hidden space, each time remaining for several hours and removing items for closer examination in the privacy of his study. The notebooks he had seen from his initial opening proved to be detailed records kept by Phineas Crowley during the final years of his life. The mason, who had died in 1869, according to cemetery records, had maintained meticulous documentation of work that went far beyond his contracted construction projects. These records, written in a clear, methodical hand that suggested formal education unusual for a tradesman of that period, described activities that had taken place in the sealed chamber between 1862 and 1868. Crowley's notebooks numbered 17 in total, each covering approximately 6 months of activities. The earliest entries, dating from January 1862, described the construction of the hidden chamber and his initial experiments with what he termed preservation techniques for anatomical study. The language was clinical and detached, suggesting that Crowley approached his work with the systematic methodology of a scientist or researcher, rather than the emotional detachment of a common criminal. The Mason's educational background became clearer as Jeremiah read through the notebooks. Crowley had apparently received training in basic anatomy and chemistry, though the source of this knowledge was never explicitly stated. His writing demonstrated familiarity with medical terminology and scientific principles that would have been unusual for a tradesman of his period. Several entries referenced books and papers on anatomy, chemistry, and what he called the science of preservation, suggesting that he had access to academic resources that were not typically available to working-class individuals. Most significantly, the notebooks revealed that Crowley had developed his techniques through years of experimentation and refinement. His early entries described failures and setbacks, problems with preservation methods, and difficulties in obtaining suitable subjects for study. The progression from these early struggles to the detailed procedures described in later notebooks showed a systematic approach to developing increasingly sophisticated methods for his work. The wooden containers arranged along the wall contained the preserved results of these studies. Each box held specimens that Crowley had prepared using techniques described in his notebooks, specimens that he had apparently intended to preserve indefinitely for future reference. The preservation methods he had employed were crude by medical standards, but effective enough that the contents remained largely intact, even after nearly a decade of storage in the sealed chamber. Crowley's preservation technique involved a combination of chemical treatments and environmental controls that drew on both traditional methods used by taxidermists and newer approaches being developed by medical schools for anatomical study. His notebooks described experiments with various chemical solutions, different methods of preparation, and techniques for creating airtight storage that would prevent decomposition over extended periods. Most disturbing were Crowley's own accounts of how he had obtained the materials for his studies. The notebooks made clear that his work had not been limited to anatomical specimens obtained through legitimate means. Beginning in 1862, he had developed what he described as more direct methods of acquisition that involved the systematic killing of individuals, selected according to criteria he had established for his research purposes. The selection criteria revealed a mind that approached murder with the same methodical analysis that characterized his construction work. Crowley had identified specific physical characteristics that made individuals suitable for his studies, age ranges, body types, and health conditions that would provide the best results for his preservation experiments. He had also developed practical considerations for victim selection, focusing on individuals whose disappearance would not immediately attract official attention or investigation. The notebooks identified 11 specific victims by name, age, and physical characteristics. They included detailed accounts of how each individual had been approached, subdued, and killed, as well as descriptions of which anatomical features had been preserved and why. The victims appeared to have been selected from transient populations, traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, individuals whose disappearance would not immediately attract official attention. Jeremiah's analysis of these accounts revealed patterns that demonstrated Crowley's systematic approach to his crimes. The Mason had maintained detailed observations of potential victims for weeks or months before taking action, studying their habits, schedules, and social connections to identify the optimal time and method for approach. He had also developed techniques for disposal of evidence and creation of plausible explanations for disappearances that would satisfy casual investigation by local authorities. Crowley's method was both simple and effective. He would approach potential victims in taverns or boarding houses, presenting himself as a fellow traveler or offering temporary employment on construction projects. Once he had gained their trust, he would invite them to examine work in progress at the house he was building on Prospect Street. The sealed chamber in the attic had been designed specifically to contain his victims during the final phase of his research. The chamber's design reflected Crowley's thorough planning and technical expertise. The space was acoustically isolated from the rest of the house through the use of specialized construction techniques that absorb sound transmission. The ventilation system was designed to prevent odors from escaping, while maintaining air quality sufficient for extended activities. The walls and floor were constructed with materials that could be easily cleaned and would not retain evidence of the activities that took place within the space. Most significantly, the chamber included features that facilitated the mason's preservation work: specialized storage areas for chemicals and equipment, work surfaces designed for anatomical procedures, and systems for waste disposal that prevented contamination of the surrounding house. The level of planning and preparation evident in the chamber's construction suggested that Crowley had been developing his techniques for years before beginning his systematic murders. The Mason's notebooks also revealed that his work had been motivated not by scientific curiosity or medical advancement, but by personal fascination with what he termed the precise moment of transition from living matter to inert material. His detailed observations focused on the physical and chemical changes that occurred during and immediately after death, with particular attention to preservation techniques that could maintain specimens in their exact state at the moment of expiration. Crowley's interest in this moment of transition appeared to stem from philosophical questions about the nature of life and death rather than practical medical concerns. His notebooks included extensive speculation about consciousness, the soul, and the physical processes that distinguished living organisms from dead matter. These reflections suggested a mind grappling with fundamental questions about human existence, but approaching those questions through systematic murder and anatomical study. The preservation techniques described in the notebooks were designed to capture and maintain the exact appearance and condition of victims at the moment of death. Crowley had experimented with various chemical treatments and environmental controls to prevent decomposition while preserving texture, color, and other physical characteristics. The goal was not simply to create anatomical specimens for study, but to maintain permanent records of the transition from life to death. By October 25, 1877, Jeremiah Kincaid had read through all of Crowley's notebooks and examined each of the preserved specimens. His own journal entries during this period reveal a man struggling with knowledge that challenged his fundamental understanding of human nature and moral responsibility. The merchant, who had built his reputation on clear-headed business decisions and rational problem-solving, found himself confronting evidence of systematic evil that defied rational response. The psychological impact of his discovery became apparent in Jeremiah's daily behavior during this period. Abigail noted in her diary that her husband had become increasingly distracted and absent-minded, often losing track of conversations or failing to respond to direct questions. Mrs. Hartwell observed that he had developed nervous habits, repeatedly checking locks on doors and windows, starting at unexpected sounds, and spending long periods staring out windows as if watching for approaching threats. The question that tormented Jeremiah was not simply what to do with his discovery, but whether anything should be done at all. Crowley had been dead for 8 years. His victims had been missing for more than a decade, and their families had long since accepted their loss. Revealing the truth would serve no practical purpose beyond satisfying abstract notions of justice, while the revelation itself would bring unbearable pain to surviving relatives and destroy the reputation of a community that had unknowingly harbored a systematic killer. Moreover, Jeremiah had to consider the implications for his own family. The house they had purchased and made their home had been the site of multiple murders. The very room where Abigail arranged flowers each morning was directly below the chamber where Crowley had conducted his final experiments on living human beings. The knowledge of what had happened in their home would fundamentally alter their relationship not only to the property, but to each other, and to their sense of safety and normalcy. The weight of this knowledge began to affect Jeremiah's health and behavior in ways that became apparent to his family, despite his efforts at concealment. His appetite decreased significantly, and he began suffering from insomnia that left him exhausted and irritable during the day. Business associates noted that his attention to detail, formerly one of his greatest strengths, had become inconsistent and unreliable. Most troubling was the change in his relationship with the house itself. Where he had previously taken pride in the property and enjoyed planning improvements and modifications, he now seemed to view the building as something to be endured rather than enjoyed. He stopped using his second-floor study, conducting all business in the ground-floor parlor, and avoided the upper levels of the house except when absolutely necessary. On October 26, 1877, Jeremiah made his decision. According to his journal, he spent that evening in the sealed chamber destroying Crowley's notebooks page by page. Burning them in a small fire he maintained in a metal basin. The wooden containers and their contents were treated with kerosene and similarly burned, though the process took most of the night and required careful attention to prevent the fire from spreading to the house's structure. The destruction of the evidence was methodical and complete. Jeremiah recorded each step of the process in his journal, noting the precautions he took to ensure that no trace of Crowley's work would survive to provide evidence of the Mason's crimes. The ashes were carefully collected and removed from the chamber, then scattered in the woods behind the house, where they would blend with natural forest debris. When the destruction was complete, Jeremiah gathered the ashes and removed them from the chamber. The space itself was then sealed more thoroughly than Crowley had managed. Using modern mortar and construction techniques that Jeremiah had learned from observing Ashworth's work earlier that week, the final step was the installation of a double layer of brick across the opening he had created, applied so skillfully that even close examination would reveal no evidence that the wall had ever been disturbed. The sealing work took place over 3 nights, with Jeremiah working alone to ensure that no one else would gain knowledge of what the chamber had contained. His journal describes the physical and emotional difficulty of this work, the confined space, the persistent smell that seemed to cling to his clothing and skin, and the psychological burden of handling the last physical evidence of multiple murders while simultaneously destroying any possibility of justice for the victims. The official story, as reported to his family and recorded in Jeremiah's business correspondence, was that structural concerns had required the permanent sealing of the attic space. Ashworth was paid for his original repairs and given to understand that the family had decided against any further work in the upper levels of the house. The carpenter's records show no indication that he suspected anything beyond routine maintenance concerns. However, the psychological impact of his discovery and the decision to conceal it affected Jeremiah profoundly. His business correspondence from late 1877 and early 1878 shows a marked change in tone and content. Where his previous letters had been confident and forward-looking, focused on expansion of his textile operations and investment opportunities, his later correspondence became increasingly cautious and pessimistic. Jeremiah's transformation was noticed by business associates throughout central Massachusetts. Partners who had worked with him for years began to comment on his reluctance to commit to long-term contracts and his tendency to withdraw from collaborative ventures that had previously engaged his enthusiasm. His reputation for reliability and sound judgment remained intact, but colleagues noted a fundamental change in his approach to business and personal relationships. Abigail noted in her own diary, discovered among her personal effects after her death in 1889, that her husband's behavior changed significantly following the attic repairs. Jeremiah has become reluctant to spend time in the upper portions of the house. she wrote in November 1877. He claims that the structural issues discovered during the renovation have made him concerned about the building's long-term stability, but his avoidance seems excessive for simple structural concerns. He has taken to conducting his evening business in the ground floor parlor rather than his usual study on the second floor, and I have noticed that he no longer takes his customary walks past the other houses on Prospect Street. More troubling to Abigail was her husband's increasing reluctance to discuss their long-term plans for the property. Before the attic renovation, Jeremiah had spoken enthusiastically about improvements he wanted to make to the house and grounds. After October 1877, he avoided such discussions entirely and appeared to regard the property more as a temporary necessity than a permanent family home. The psychological burden of his secret knowledge manifested in other ways as well. Jeremiah began suffering from insomnia, often remaining awake until the early hours of morning, walking through the ground floor rooms of the house. When Abigail questioned these nocturnal habits, he explained that he was reviewing business documents and preferred to work when the house was quiet. However, Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, reported that during these nighttime wanderings, Jeremiah carried no papers or writing materials, but simply moved from room to room as if conducting some form of inspection or surveillance. Mrs. Hartwell's observations were particularly valuable because of her long experience with household routines and her natural discretion regarding family privacy. Her notebooks, discovered after her death in 1894, provide detailed accounts of the changes in the Kincaid household following the attic renovation. These records would later prove essential for understanding the long-term psychological impact of Jeremiah's discovery. Mr. Kincaid's nighttime wanderings follow a consistent pattern, she wrote in December 1877. He begins in the parlor, checking the windows and door locks repeatedly before moving to the dining room and kitchen. He pays particular attention to any sounds from the upper floors, often stopping to listen for several minutes at a time. His route through the house suggests he is not searching for anything specific, but rather ensuring that the building remains secure and that no disturbances have occurred during the night. The merchant also developed an unusual interest in the history of their neighbors and the previous occupants of other houses in the area. He began making regular visits to the town clerk's office to review property records and death certificates, ostensibly for business purposes, but actually searching for evidence that Crowley might have conducted similar activities elsewhere. This research consumed increasing amounts of his time and attention, but revealed nothing that suggested the Masons' crimes had extended beyond the Prospect Street property. Jeremiah's research into Crowley's background and activities became increasingly obsessive during the winter of 1877 and 1878. His journal entries from this period reveal a man tormented by the possibility that the Masons' crimes might have been more extensive than the evidence suggested, and by the fear that other similar criminals might be operating undetected in communities throughout Massachusetts. The investigation led Jeremiah to examine records from every town where Crowley had worked during his career. This research required extensive correspondence with clerks, local officials, and business associates throughout central Massachusetts, and the time demands began to interfere with his normal business operations. Partners noted that he had become distracted and unreliable, often canceling meetings or failing to respond to correspondence in a timely manner. Most significantly, Jeremiah began making inquiries about the families of Crowley's victims, using the information from the destroyed notebooks to trace the descendants of the individuals who had been killed in his attic. These investigations were conducted discreetly, through business associates and social contacts, and were presented as routine background research for potential business partnerships. What Jeremiah discovered through these inquiries provided no comfort. Of the 11 families affected by Crowley's crimes, 9 had suffered lasting financial and emotional consequences from the disappearance of their relative. Fathers who had vanished while seeking seasonal employment had left families without income or closure. Young men who had disappeared while traveling to new opportunities had left parents and siblings with decades of uncertainty about their fate. The human cost of Crowley's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass dozens of individuals whose lives had been permanently altered by loss and uncertainty. The family histories that Jeremiah uncovered revealed the lasting impact of unexplained disappearances on survivors. In several cases, family businesses had failed after the loss of key individuals. Marriages had been delayed or canceled due to financial instability caused by missing relatives. Children had grown up without fathers or older brothers, altering family dynamics and economic prospects for entire generations. This knowledge reinforced Jeremiah's decision to maintain his silence, but also intensified his psychological burden. He was not simply concealing evidence of past crimes, but actively denying closure to families who had spent years hoping for answers about their missing relatives. His journal entries from early 1878 reveal a man trapped between irreconcilable moral obligations, the duty to preserve his family's peace of mind and the obligation to provide justice for Crowley's victims. The weight of this moral dilemma began to affect Jeremiah's physical health during the early months of 1878. He developed tremors in his hands that made writing difficult, and his appetite decreased to the point where Abigail became concerned about his nutritional condition. Sleep became increasingly elusive, and when he did manage to rest, he was troubled by vivid nightmares that left him exhausted and disoriented. Dr. Samuel Hartley, the family physician, was consulted about Jeremiah's declining health in February 1878. Dr. Hartley, a competent medical practitioner trained at Harvard Medical School, found no evidence of physical illness, but noted signs of severe nervous exhaustion and what would later be recognized as symptoms of psychological trauma. His recommendation was rest and a temporary reduction in business responsibilities, advice that Jeremiah found impossible to follow given his obsessive need to monitor and protect the secret he had concealed. By spring 1878, Jeremiah's condition had begun to affect his business operations significantly. Associates noted that he had become increasingly distracted during meetings and reluctant to commit to long-term contracts or investments. His correspondence from this period reveals growing preoccupation with themes of guilt, responsibility, and the consequences of concealed knowledge. In a letter to his business partner, dated April 15, 1878, he wrote, "I have come to believe that certain types of knowledge carry obligations that extend beyond the individual who possesses them. The weight of such knowledge can become unbearable, not because of what it reveals about past events, but because of what it demands regarding future actions." The breaking point came in late April 1878, when Jeremiah received an unexpected visitor who inadvertently revealed just how well Crowley had concealed his activities from his contemporaries. Amos Whitmore, the nephew of the house's previous owner, arrived to collect some personal effects that had been overlooked during the estate settlement. During his visit, Whitmore mentioned that his uncle had always spoken highly of Phineas Crowley's character and workmanship. Uncle Cornelius considered Crowley one of the most reliable men in the county. Whitmore told Jeremiah as they examined some books in the ground floor library. He often said that Crowley's attention to detail and commitment to client privacy made him the perfect craftsman for families who valued discretion. Uncle Cornelius mentioned that Crowley had done some special work on the upper levels of the house that required unusual materials and techniques, but that the mason had never discussed the specifics with anyone. Uncle Cornelius respected that kind of professional discretion. The irony of this praise for Crowley's discretion was not lost on Jeremiah, who realized that the mason's reputation for privacy had been crucial to concealing his crimes. Crowley had been able to conduct his activities in the sealed chamber precisely because his neighbors and clients expected him to be secretive about his work methods and client requirements. His unusual requests for materials and his habit of working alone during odd hours had been interpreted as professional quirks rather than warning signs. This conversation convinced Jeremiah that revealing Crowley's crimes would serve no purpose beyond destroying the Mason's posthumous reputation and shocking a community that had no responsibility for his actions. The people who had known and trusted Crowley were themselves victims of his deception, and exposing that deception would cause them to question their judgment and feel complicit in crimes they could never have prevented or detected. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating for Jeremiah. His journal entry for April 28, 1878, reveals a man who had reached the limits of his emotional endurance. "I have concluded that some knowledge is meant to die with those who acquire it. P. Crowley chose to conceal his crimes rather than reveal them, perhaps understanding that exposure would cause more suffering than concealment. I have followed his example, not out of sympathy for his actions, but out of consideration for those who would be harmed by revelation of the truth. This decision will remain my burden alone, and I pray that I have strength to carry it until my own death releases me from the obligation." The journal itself was sealed in a metal container and hidden within the walls of Jeremiah's ground-floor study during renovations conducted in summer 1878. The container would not be discovered until 1892, when the house was being prepared for demolition following the deaths of both Jeremiah and Abigail Kincaid. The final years of the Kincaid family's residence on Prospect Street were marked by an outward return to normalcy that concealed ongoing psychological damage. Jeremiah gradually resumed normal business activities, though he never again displayed the enthusiasm and confidence that had characterized his earlier career. Abigail adapted to her husband's changed personality and learned to avoid topics or activities that seemed to disturb him. Mrs. Hartwell continued her duties without apparent awareness that anything significant had changed, though she later reported to neighbors that the family had become more private and less interested in social activities. The house itself showed signs of unusual neglect during this period. While the Kincaids maintained the ground-floor rooms in perfect condition, they showed little interest in the upper levels beyond basic maintenance. The second-floor bedrooms were used only for storage, and the family essentially lived entirely on the ground floor. Visitors noted that the house felt smaller and more cramped than its actual dimensions would suggest, as if entire sections of the building had been deliberately abandoned. Most tellingly, the Kincaids never invited guests to stay overnight. Despite having adequate space and a tradition of hospitality that had been established during their first months in the house. When questioned about this change, they explained that ongoing structural concerns made them reluctant to allow anyone to sleep in the upper rooms. This explanation was accepted without suspicion, particularly given the extensive repairs that had been conducted in late 1877. The psychological isolation created by his secret knowledge gradually affected Jeremiah's relationship with his wife and community. While he maintained the external forms of social interaction, his participation became increasingly mechanical and distant. Abigail noted in her diary that conversations with her husband had become stilted and formal, as if he were always carefully considering his words before speaking. She attributed this change to business pressures and the normal effects of aging, but the transformation was more fundamental than she realized. The burden of concealment also affected Jeremiah's relationship with the house itself. He began to view the property not as a home, but as a repository of dangerous knowledge that required constant vigilance to maintain safely. His nighttime wanderings through the ground-floor rooms became a ritual of inspection and reassurance, confirming that the sealed chamber above remained undisturbed and that no evidence of his discovery had become visible to others. This vigilance extended to an obsessive attention to structural changes that might compromise the concealment he had constructed. Any crack in the walls or ceiling, any settling noise from the building's frame, any maintenance requirement that might bring workmen into contact with the upper levels of the house became a source of anxiety that required immediate attention. The Kincaids' household expenses during this period show unusually frequent payments to contractors for minor repairs and inspections that seemed excessive to their neighbors. The psychological cost of this constant vigilance became apparent in Jeremiah's physical decline during the early 1880s. Associates noted that he had developed a tremor in his hands and a habit of startling at unexpected sounds. His physician, Dr. Samuel Hartley, diagnosed nervous exhaustion and recommended rest and travel, but Jeremiah refused to leave the house for extended periods. His stated reason was concern about business obligations, but the true motivation was his unwillingness to leave the property unguarded for any length of time. Dr. Hartley's medical records, preserved in the archives of the Massachusetts Medical Society, provide detailed documentation of Jeremiah's declining health during this period. The physician noted symptoms that were consistent with what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder: persistent anxiety, hypervigilance, insomnia, and an exaggerated startle response. However, the medical understanding of psychological trauma was limited in the 1880s, and Dr. Hartley could only treat the physical symptoms without addressing their underlying psychological causes. The end came suddenly in December 1883 when Jeremiah suffered what Dr. Hartley described as a complete nervous collapse following a minor incident that would have been insignificant under normal circumstances. A heavy snowfall had caused some ice damage to the roof gutters, and water had begun dripping into the second-floor hallway near the attic staircase. The workmen hired to repair the damage had asked for access to the attic to check for structural problems, and Jeremiah's refusal to allow this inspection had escalated into a confrontation that left him shaking and incoherent. The incident occurred on December 18, 1883, when a local handyman named Patrick O'Brien arrived to assess the water damage. O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had established a reputation for reliable maintenance work throughout Cedar Falls, was accustomed to examining entire buildings to identify the source of problems. His request for attic access was routine and practical, but Jeremiah's violent refusal to allow the inspection shocked both O'Brien and the family members who witnessed the confrontation. Abigail found her husband that evening sitting in his study, staring at the wall where his hidden journal was concealed. When she spoke to him, he responded only to say that the weight is too much for one man to carry. Dr. Hartley was summoned, but could provide no treatment beyond sedatives and rest. Jeremiah died in his sleep 3 days later, officially from heart failure, though Dr. Hartley privately believed that exhaustion and nervous strain had been contributing factors. The discovery of Jeremiah's hidden journal during the house's demolition in 1892 created a dilemma for the authorities who had to decide how to handle evidence of decades-old crimes. The journal's account of Crowley's activities was detailed enough to be credible, but all of the primary actors were dead, and pursuing the case would require extensive investigation for no practical purpose beyond historical accuracy. Town Selectman William Crawford, who reviewed the journal before making the decision about public disclosure, noted in his official report that revealing Crowley's crimes would cause unnecessary distress to families and individuals who bear no responsibility for those actions, while providing no benefit beyond satisfying public curiosity about historical events. The decision was made to seal the journal in municipal archives, where it remained until 1952. The demolition of the house itself revealed additional evidence that supported Jeremiah's account while raising new questions about the extent of Crowley's activities. The workmen discovered not only the sealed chamber in the attic, but also several hidden compartments in the basement and walls that had been designed to conceal evidence of the Masons' crimes. These discoveries suggested that Crowley's activities had been even more systematic and extensive than the journal had indicated. The house itself was demolished in early 1893, and the lot remained empty for more than a decade before being subdivided for smaller residences. During the demolition, workmen discovered the sealed chamber in the attic, but found only empty space and some scattered ash that might have been the remains of burned materials. No evidence of Crowley's crimes survived to provide physical corroboration of Jeremiah's journal account. However, the demolition crew reported several unusual discoveries that suggested the house's history had been more complex than official records indicated. The foundation contained several rooms and passages that did not appear on any architectural plans, suggesting that Crowley had incorporated hidden spaces into the building's design from the beginning. The mortar used in certain sections of the basement walls contained fragments of fabric and other organic materials that had been deliberately incorporated during construction, possibly to conceal evidence of the Masons' earlier activities. Most significantly, the crew discovered that the basement floor in several areas had been repeatedly excavated and refilled, creating a patchwork of different soil types and compaction levels that suggested extensive digging over a period of years. While no human remains were found during the demolition, the soil analysis conducted by state authorities indicated the presence of lime and other chemicals typically used for rapid decomposition of organic materials. These discoveries led to a more extensive investigation of Phineas Crowley's other construction projects in the area. Between 1893 and 1895, authorities examined 17 properties that Crowley had built or extensively renovated during his career. 5 of these properties showed evidence of unusual basement construction similar to that found at the Kincaid house, including hidden chambers and soil disturbances that suggested possible burial sites. However, none of these investigations produced definitive evidence of additional crimes, and the costs of extensive excavation could not be justified without stronger proof of wrongdoing. The official conclusion was that Crowley had been an eccentric builder whose unusual construction methods reflected personal quirks rather than criminal activity. The families of Crowley's alleged victims were never informed about Jeremiah's journal or the discoveries made during the house's demolition. This decision was made partly to avoid reopening old wounds, but also because the evidence was circumstantial and could not provide the definitive answers that those families deserved. The authorities concluded that revealing partial information would be more cruel than maintaining the silence that had already lasted for decades. In 1952, a graduate student in history at Harvard University named Margaret Thornton discovered Jeremiah's journal while researching 19th-century New England business practices. Her initial plan was to use the journal as source material for her thesis on merchant families in small Massachusetts communities, but the content forced her to abandon that project and focus instead on the question of how evidence of historical crimes should be handled by researchers and authorities. Margaret Thornton came from a family of academics and had received thorough training in historical methodology and archival research. Her dissertation advisor, Professor Edmund Walsh, was a specialist in New England social history who had developed innovative techniques for analyzing personal documents and family papers. When Thornton brought Jeremiah's journal to his attention, Professor Walsh recognized immediately that it represented both an important historical discovery and a complex ethical challenge. Thornton's analysis of the journal, completed in 1954 but never published, concluded that Jeremiah's account was likely accurate based on historical and psychological evidence. Her research confirmed the disappearances of several individuals matching Crowley's alleged victims, and her examination of town records revealed patterns of behavior and association that supported Jeremiah's description of the Masons' methods and opportunities. More importantly, Thornton's work provided insight into the psychological dynamics that had led both Crowley and Jeremiah to choose concealment over revelation. Her analysis suggested that both men had been motivated by a desire to protect their communities from knowledge that would fundamentally alter their understanding of human nature and social safety. The decision to hide evidence of systematic evil reflected not moral cowardice, but a rational calculation that exposure would cause more harm than concealment. However, Thornton also noted that this logic created ethical problems that extended beyond the original crimes. By choosing concealment, both Crowley and Jeremiah had denied justice to victims and closure to their families. They had also allowed the possibility that similar crimes might continue undetected, since other potential perpetrators might assume that such activities could be successfully concealed indefinitely. Thornton's research methodology included extensive interviews with descendants of families who had lived in Cedar Falls during the relevant period, as well as genealogical research to trace the fate of Crowley's alleged victims and their survivors. This work revealed the lasting impact of unexplained disappearances on family structures and community relationships, providing context for understanding both Crowley's victim selection and Jeremiah's decision to maintain secrecy. The psychological analysis that formed the core of Thornton's work drew on emerging understanding of trauma and guilt to explain the behavior of both men. She concluded that Crowley's systematic approach to murder reflected a profound psychological disorder that allowed him to compartmentalize his crimes and maintain a normal social facade. Jeremiah's response to discovering evidence of those crimes demonstrated the devastating impact that knowledge of evil can have on individuals who are forced to bear that knowledge alone. Thornton's final conclusion was that there were no clear ethical guidelines for handling such discoveries, and that each situation required individual judgment based on the specific circumstances and the likely consequences of various courses of action. Her work influenced later developments in historical methodology and professional ethics for researchers, but provided no definitive answers to the questions raised by Jeremiah's journal. The journal itself was returned to municipal archives in 1955, where it was reclassified as a restricted document, available only to qualified researchers with specific justification for access. This policy remained in effect until 1967, when changing attitudes toward historical transparency led to its inclusion in the public archive collection. However, the document has received little attention from historians or genealogists, partly because its contents remain difficult to verify and partly because the ethical questions it raises have no clear resolution. The site where the Kincaid house once stood now contains 3 modest residences built in the 1920s. The current occupants are apparently unaware of the property's history, and no unusual incidents or discoveries have been reported. The basement construction of the modern houses did not extend deep enough to disturb any evidence that might remain from Crowley's period of activity. Cedar Falls itself has grown substantially since 1877, and most residents are unaware of the events that occurred on Prospect Street more than a century ago. The town's historical society maintains records of prominent families and significant events, but the Kincaid family and Phineas Crowley receive only brief mentions in standard historical accounts. The darker aspects of the town's past remain known only to a few researchers and archivists who have encountered Jeremiah's journal in the course of their work. The question of whether Jeremiah Kincaid made the correct decision in concealing evidence of Phineas Crowley's crimes remains open to debate among historians and ethicists who have studied the case. Arguments can be made for both sides that revealing the truth would have provided justice and closure, and that concealment prevented unnecessary suffering for innocent people. What is clear is that the psychological burden of his knowledge affected Jeremiah profoundly and may have contributed to his premature death. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is not Crowley's crimes themselves, but the ease with which they were concealed and might have remained hidden indefinitely. The Mason's reputation for discretion and professionalism allowed him to conduct systematic murder for years without arousing suspicion. Jeremiah's decision to destroy evidence and reseal the chamber ensured that the truth emerged only through accident, decades after it could serve any practical purpose. The case raises fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility, and about the circumstances under which concealment might be justified despite its costs to justice and truth. These questions have no easy answers, particularly when the revelation of historical crimes would affect people who had no connection to the original events and no power to prevent them. What emerges most clearly from Jeremiah's journal and the subsequent investigation is that the impact of Crowley's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass their families. The Kincaid family who discovered the evidence, the community that unknowingly harbored a killer, and even the researchers who later encountered the historical record. Evil, once committed, creates consequences that ripple outward through time in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. The sealed chamber in the attic of the house on Prospect Street became a symbol of secrets that resist revelation, knowledge that carries unbearable responsibilities, and truths that may be too dangerous to acknowledge. Whether Phineas Crowley originally intended his concealment to be temporary or permanent, and whether Jeremiah Kincaid's decision to maintain that concealment was wise or cowardly, may never be definitively determined. What remains clear is that the autumn of 1877 marked a turning point, not only for the Kincaid family, but for the entire community of Cedar Falls. The discovery of Crowley's crimes and the subsequent decision to conceal them created ripple effects that extended through generations, affecting individuals who had no direct connection to the original events, but whose lives were nonetheless shaped by their consequences. The weight of such knowledge, as Jeremiah wrote in his final journal entry, may indeed be too much for one person to carry alone. His experience demonstrates the psychological cost of bearing secrets that challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and social safety. The isolation and anxiety that characterized his final years serve as a reminder that some burdens are too heavy to be borne in silence, even when revelation would bring its own painful consequences. And perhaps that realization, more than any other aspect of this case, explains why some doors are meant to remain sealed, some chambers are meant to stay hidden, and some truths are meant to rest undisturbed in the darkness where they were first concealed. The Masons' work in that attic chamber was finished in 1877, when the Kincaid family made the decision to brick up that space forever, not to hide a crime, but to prevent one terrible discovery from destroying the peace of mind that allows communities to function and families to survive. The echoes of those events continue to resonate in ways both subtle and profound. The families who lost relatives to Crowley's crimes never received the closure they deserved, but they were also spared the horrific knowledge of how those relatives died. The community of Cedar Falls maintained its sense of security and social cohesion, but at the cost of harboring an incomplete understanding of its own history, and the truth itself, while partially preserved in Jeremiah's journal, remains forever incomplete due to the destruction of evidence that might have provided definitive answers to questions that continue to haunt those who encounter this case. Perhaps the most lasting lesson of the Kincaid family's discovery is that knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten or ignored. The burden of that knowledge becomes part of the person who possesses it, shaping their understanding of the world and their place within it. For Jeremiah Kincaid, the weight of what he learned in that sealed chamber proved ultimately unbearable, transforming him from a confident merchant into a haunted man who died protecting others from truths he believed they could not endure. Whether his sacrifice was justified Whether the pain he endured in silence was worth the peace he preserved for others remains a question without clear answers. What is certain is that the autumn of 1877 in Cedar Falls, Massachusetts, stands as a reminder that some discoveries change not only what we know about the past, but how we understand the very nature of human existence and the fragile foundations upon which our sense of safety and community rest.